Okay, good morning, everybody, or good afternoon, as the case may be. I'm Simon Jackman. I'm the Chief Executive Officer and Professor of Political Science at the United States Study Centre at the University of Sydney. And before we get any further, let me pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging of the First Nations peoples from wherever you may be, but here in Sydney, the United States Study Centre and the University of Sydney stands on the traditional lands of the Gadigal people, who are part of the Eora Nation. And speaking of country, our thoughts, of course, are with what's happening to country, a bit more wet than the country might need or want at this people, and of course, the people who live on it. And I'm thinking particularly of my friends and family in Southeast Queensland, and I'm sure many of you on this call today have friends and loved ones also being affected by this extraordinary rain bomb that's been assaulting the eastern seaboard of Australia this last week or so. And of course, as a US study centre, our thoughts are, of course, these extraordinary events that are unfolding in Eastern Europe, in Ukraine. And of course, that will come to be a big part of our conversation today. Extraordinarily significant event, even though our frame, or perhaps especially because our frame is US politics, and a preview of President Joe Biden's first State of the Union address. The US Constitution, of course, mandates that the president, quote, shall from time to time give Congress information of the state of the union, capital S, capital U. And of course, now that is one of the high points, one of the set plays in the Washington, D.C. political calendar. And of course, the speech this time will take place roughly about 27 or 28 hours from now on a Tuesday night in Washington. And coming at this point, given, as I alluded to earlier, what's happening in Eastern Europe, but also the state of play in US politics, this is a midterm election year. And we'll talk about Biden's approval ratings in a moment. An awful lot of relevant political context to talk about as we get to sort of a preview of this speech. And it's that broader political context we'll spend most of our time talking about. Joining me today from the US Study Centre is Associate Professor David Smith, jointly appointed between the US Study Centre, but his university appointment is in the Department of Government and International Relations in the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences at the University of Sydney. David, a Sydney product, but went to the United States for his PhD, which he received from one of America's great higher educational institutions and great centers of excellence in political science, Big Blue, the University of Michigan. David, of course, his research examines political relations between the state and minorities, but has a particular focus on the role of religion in US politics and society. Bruce Wolpe is a non-resident senior fellow at the United States Study Centre. Bruce, as I often say, is the hardest working commentator on US politics. You can't miss Bruce across multiple platforms in Australia. We're especially interested, and I'll turn to Bruce in just a moment to tee this up for us. Bruce, extensive experience on two Capitol Hills, one in Washington and one in Canberra. We'll be drawing on Bruce's expertise on the US side presently. And Bruce, of course, though, is a published author with a university press. An astonishing book that details what Bruce saw up close in the way Congress really works up close, particularly through this committee system, something that's not very well understood by Americans, let alone non-Americans. That book that Bruce has co-authored, now in its second edition, was published by the University of Michigan Press, and see my earlier comments about University of Michigan's excellence with respect to political science. Quite a prestigious publication. for Bruce and in turn for the US Study Center. We're also joined today, I'm delighted to welcome Victoria Cooper to our conversation today. Victoria is a research associate here at the US Study Center. Again, like David Smith, a product of the University of Sydney, majoring here in politics, international relations, and American studies. Victoria has had a variety of research roles, has a particular interest in right-wing extremism, drug and alcohol reform, is one of a number of, it's one of the great joys of running the Study Center to have young, energetic researchers with broad interests in our midst, and that the US Study Center provides a home and extracts value, frankly, from smart, hardworking people like Victoria. Victoria is also the editor-in-chief at the Young Diplomat Society. So, good morning, everybody. And Bruce, I gather we didn't talk about this in the lead-up, but from what we were saying before we came live on air, I'm gathering you're not in Australia right now.
No, thank you, Simon. Thank you for your very generous words. It's an honor to be with David and Victoria and you to discuss the State of the Union 28 hours from now and what is going to unfold. No, I'm reporting tonight from Colorado, and so it's all downhill from here, let me just tell you. Okay. I just want to set the scene for the State of the Union that we'll be watching on television. In historic terms, it just seems to me this is the first State of the Union in recent memory where a major war is unfolding in real time that involves important interests of the United States. Of course, many recent presidents have addressed wars that have been ongoing, Afghanistan and Iraq in particular. George W. Bush, the 9/11 events occurred some 4 months before his State of the Union in 2002. So here we are in real time with a very vicious war underway affecting the United States, and that will shape the speech. And the speech that Biden's going to deliver is not what he anticipated even a month ago. And it has been upended to a certain extent, and it'll be very interesting to see how that plays out. Second, you're going to see a full chamber with COVID restrictions eased, and that hasn't happened in 2 years. It'll be interesting to see how many members wear masks or don't wear masks. But there will not be visitors in the gallery, and habitual viewers of State of the Union addresses will recall how presidents have often gone to heroes and to honor them, but also make political points. There won't be any of that. So the focus is going to be between the president and those members sitting in the chamber. Third, the Capitol defense that was not sufficient on January 6th last year is back. Reinforced, and offenses surrounding the Capitol. So there is not a martial atmosphere, but a heightened security atmosphere. And that's a legacy of the events of last year. There's also a truck convoy bearing down on the Capitol, inspired by events in Canada. That will undoubtedly get news attention. We'll have to see how that plays out. I think they want to clog the Beltway to at least make a major statement about how they feel on various issues. The tableau that you see is going to be very interesting. It is the president, the vice president, and the Speaker of the House. And a couple of things come to mind. First, will this be Nancy Pelosi's last State of the Union address as Speaker of the House? And as the camera turns to the Republican leaders, is Kevin McCarthy looking at her seat and saying, I'm going to be there next year, and I will be presiding over the chamber next year. So that's going to be interesting. So you have a lot of history, a lot of politics, a lot of crisis, and in a highly partisan atmosphere.
Thanks, Bruce. It's an astonishing piece of political theater. If nothing else, the State of the Union. For this occasion, the main shot, of course, will be a Democratic President, Joe Biden, flanked by a Democratic Speaker and a Democratic Vice President, both women. But one of the highlights for me, just taking the spectacle of it, are those big applause moments, and when the camera turns around to swing back over the chamber, and we were talking about this in the early going, in the pre-game that we had before we went live. For how many of those big applause lines will we see Republicans up on their feet, and for which moments of Biden's speech do we see unity, and for which moments do we see disunity? And that might be a springboard to bring in David Smith. David, I'm wondering, your take of just putting this speech where it sits in the current context of US domestic politics.
Yeah, and so there have been reports that this speech has been substantially rewritten to focus on Ukraine. Now, that's an entirely correct focus given the immediacy of the crisis, but I think it's also something that Biden would much prefer to talk about than a lot of other things. There's been some polling data released today showing that something like 82 or 83% of Americans are in favour of sanctions on Russia. The majority of Americans would not want to see US military action in Ukraine, but they're certainly in favour of sanctions. So that's something that Biden can point to, that he's done, that he is doing, that has a broad base of support in the American population, and actually has a pretty broad base of support in Congress as well. When pressed, most Republican members of Congress have condemned Putin, not all of them, but most. They've avoided talking about Trump's stance on Putin. So that is, he won't get every Republican applauding, but he'll at least get some Republicans applauding when he talks about what the US is doing in Ukraine. His actions in Ukraine are broadly in line with public opinion about what they think should be happening in Ukraine. So he will get some applause lines there. Beyond that, it's going to be very difficult for him, I think. And it after about May of last year got very difficult for Biden. And I think that it's really hard to underestimate how demoralizing it was for Americans that they appeared to be getting out of COVID. And then along came the Delta wave, and along came the Omicron wave, and you had the return to school closing and the return to mass infections and mass deaths. I think when you look at the way that Biden's approval rating really fell off last year, yeah, the withdrawal from Afghanistan had something to do with it, but it really closely kind of followed the trajectory of COVID as well, and the economic trajectory of COVID too, with as much as some economic indices have been improving, inflation is the big one that is just so visible to people in their everyday lives. And I mean, when talking about public support for sanctions, I actually have seen polling that suggests that a majority of Americans would be prepared to see increased gas prices as a result of further sanctions on Ukraine. But there's a difference between telling a pollster that, oh yeah, I'm prepared to make that sacrifice for Ukraine, and how you actually respond when those prices happen after a year of those price increases already happening. So I think it's entirely appropriate for Biden to be talking about Ukraine, but I think he'll also be really hanging on to this as something that will appeal to a broader base of people than he'll be able to appeal to otherwise.
Yeah, that's a great point for me to turn to Victoria, David. Before I do so, I'll just say you can submit questions live in real time with the Q&A function here in the Zoom window. We will be turning to some pre-submitted questions, but also any live questions that come our way, say around about the bottom of the hour, transitioning through the second half of the webinar to responding to some of those questions from you. But Victoria, David mentioned, I think, yes, Ukraine is the international situation, and on balance, and I think David made a persuasive case for this, a net positive for Biden. Will give him plenty of softballs to hit there in terms of speech making, and appeals to national unity and projecting himself as commander-in-chief, all that presidential stuff. But meanwhile, Victoria, we've got a president of the United States with an approval rating that isn't great. We've got a party that is, on balance, I would assess, demoralized, that they haven't done more with their majorities, slim as they are, in both chambers of Congress, looking ahead to the midterms. I wonder if you could perhaps share with us some of your observations about what it is that that the Democrats have accomplished in terms of implementing sort of quote unquote the Biden agenda, and the extent to which those domestic considerations are going to loom large in this speech, and more broadly, perhaps, Victoria, how the policy frame and that comes out, the domestic policy frame that might come out of this speech in the run up towards midterm elections.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right in the sense that his approval ratings are particularly low. They've been hovering in the low 40s for a long time now, and no president has had approval ratings that low at this point in their presidency other than Trump. And I think that stands in contrast to who people thought they elected. I think when they elected Biden, one of the main things was that he was going to be someone to bring the country back to a sense of normalcy and stability and competency. So for him to share those kind of low approval ratings with Trump, I think sits really uncomfortably, and sits especially uncomfortably for the Democrats, especially if that was kind of, fire for their election in 2020. I wonder what that will mean for the midterms if they were elected to not be Trump and they're sort of mirroring Trump at this point. I don't know if that puts them in good standing heading into November. But in terms of the state of the union, it is bleak, as David was pointing out, that there's lots of things that haven't gone particularly well. But I wonder as well if there's maybe too much fixation that the Democrats are flat out flailing. I think there's a lot of whataboutism, and they've actually done really well in a lot of senses. If you look at the constraints that they have incredibly small majorities, and I think a 50-50 split in the Senate, for example, and I think if you look at Obama had 57 Democrat members, and Biden has managed to pass more than Obama did in his first 11 months with only 50. So I get the sense that, anyone can play poker with a bad hand, but it takes a real maestro to play poker with anyone can play poker with a good hand, but it takes a real maestro to play well with a bad one. And just to run through some of the highlights, it's hard to go past the infrastructure bill. I mean, that was the one big fixation for the year. Perhaps the second flank of that hasn't passed yet, and that's been a huge disappointment, and also has revealed Democrat infighting, which also doesn't fare well for the administration. But that infrastructure bill was really needed. I mean, in January this year, Biden went to Pennsylvania and a bridge collapsed in Pittsburgh. Axios released a report earlier this month that said a third of the nation's bridges needed major repairs, and take 30 years at this rate to fix all America's structurally deficient bridges. The infrastructure bill was needed. It was expensive. It was $1 trillion, but it also got the support of 19 Republicans, including Mitch McConnell, who, as we all know, has made it his policy to be against anything that the Biden administration will put forward, or the Democrats will put forward. So that's a major achievement. And some of these things have been getting attention, but others haven't. And I think one that I'd like to draw attention to is Biden appointed the most number of federal judges in his first year since Reagan. So Trump appointed 19, Obama appointed 13, and Biden appointed 42. And it's also the most diverse range in terms of both background, in terms of his appointed public defenders, and that includes his recent Supreme Court pick, which we might get to later. But also demographically diverse, and that's been an election promise. He said he wants institutions that look like America, and he's been delivering on that. And that's important. These judges are going to hear cases of national significance, and he's learning from Obama, who had 30% of his nominees shut down in his second term. So I think there's been a lot of attention on the negatives, but there's been a lot of positives from the administration, and especially considering those constraints of those slim majorities and other things like Mitch McConnell, the pandemic just adding another plate in the air to juggle, and the unforeseen Delta and Omicron strains. I think when you consider those things and the expectations thrust upon Biden in his first year, that he's done exceptionally well, and perhaps that deserves a bit more attention.
That's terrific, Victoria. You've covered a ton of ground there that I want to perhaps cycle through. over the balance of our time, quite literally. I mean, I think we'll spend the next 15, 20 minutes perhaps getting to that. Bruce, Victoria's assessment there, and perhaps the premise in my question to her about Democrats feeling as though, look, my assessment would be 12 months ago, Democrats were telling themselves a historic opportunity for the biggest expansion of the US social safety spending net since the Great Society, if not the New Deal. And you and I talked about this in webinars, in private. Got to go hard. They have to go hard. That'll be the impulse. They've got to make them. They can't go back to their primary election constituencies, let alone the general election, with a pair of sixes. Speaking about playing your card analogy, Victoria. I'd just be interested, Bruce, your assessments of that mindset inside the Democratic Party right now about how they're thinking about what they've accomplished, what messages they're going to take back home. First things first, primaries, which are imminent, and then with a long tail, but then heading into the midterm elections come the fall. And then perhaps the speech in that context, Bruce.
Thanks so much. I agree with everything that David and Victoria have outlined, and it's absolutely true. Biden has accomplished more in those areas that when he started with the recovery program, much bigger than Obama's, the infrastructure program, one of the biggest in history. But he hasn't delivered on the social support programs in education, in health, in seniors, in childcare, and in tax cuts. And Washington has now stopped. Nothing significant has passed since the infrastructure bill, and people are looking at it. People are very rational. The economy, inflation is really hitting them hard. It's a choppy world. There is no normal, and Washington is deadlocked and can't produce. So who do you blame? You blame the President of the United States because he is in charge, and that's why his approval is at 37% walking in there. So in terms of the speech, I think he wants to outline first of all, recall what he has done. And this will be the largest audience he's had since the inauguration. And he needs it to try and make some breakthrough, cut through and get some points. He wants to tell everyone what he has accomplished. He wants to outline what he believes can still be gotten this year and the responsibility of Democrats to do it. And then I think he wants to ask the Republicans, well, what do you stand for? What are you for? And why are you you're not working with us? And so puts some of the burden for this on them, and he'll call them extremists in some regard. So I think that's what he wants to do. He has Biden has no choice. He's losing 31 members in the chamber. Democrats that are listening to the speech will not be there after the November election. They've announced their retirement. He has gone out and campaigned on the infrastructure bill, as Victoria said in Pittsburgh. When a bridge collapses, Biden shows up and says, "I have the answer." But he really needs to create, and people look at him, just given his age and given how Washington is deadlocked, he has to give them a sense of confidence that he is managing this country. And that's, if he can do some of that, that will be a major achievement coming out of the speech.
David, both Victoria and Bruce have alluded to Biden's approval numbers. In graduate school in the US, like me, David, I'm sure you learned about the rally around the flag effect and the various theories for it. I think it's an interesting data point that at least in polls that were fielded late last week over the weekend in the United States, Victoria's observation is true. And indeed, an ABC News Washington Post poll came, the first digit was a 38% approval rating. This into a major international crisis where, frankly, the US is showing leadership. The NATO alliance appears to have been shocked out of complacency and domicility is sort of, I guess the question is, why aren't Biden's numbers better in general, but why aren't they recovering in the way that often crises provoke this so-called rally around the flag effect?
Yeah, this is very interesting because, as I pointed out, what Biden is actually doing in Ukraine has about an 84% approval rating. But when you ask respondents, do you approve of Biden's handling of the Ukraine crisis, it's below 50%. So at the moment, that question, that's just a proxy for how people feel about Biden in general. I'm beginning to wonder whether approval ratings in the low 40s are basically the new normal. I mean, this is what it was for Trump's presidency. It's what it is for Biden's presidency. And it wasn't that much higher during Obama's presidency. During Obama's presidency, it was more like between 45 and 50, but it was in the 40s. The 40s seemed to be the new natural home of presidential approval. As far as this crisis goes, I think there is an important difference between this and a lot of other crises, which is at the moment, Americans are not directly involved in it. American soldiers aren't directly involved in it. There haven't been any Americans attacked. At the moment, for Americans, this is a bad thing that's happening to another place. And yes, they don't like what's going on, but it's not the same sense of their own country being under threat, which is typically what generates a rally round the flag effect. The last time we actually saw that was in March of 2020, when there was a bit of a rally around the flag effect for Trump. That was, as far as I can remember, that was basically Trump's highest approval ratings came then. But I don't know if we are ever going to get the kinds of rally round the flag effects that we got in, say, 2001, where George W. Bush had 80% approval for a year following 9/11, or even what we saw for George W. Bush's father during the Iraq War, where about a year before he got voted out by the American people, he was also enjoying 80% approval ratings. When Osama bin Laden was killed in 2011, there was about a week period where Obama's approval rating went up to 60%, but then came back down again. So I think that there's some evidence to suggest that in the current very partisan environment, and where there's a very different kind of media as well, a far more fragmented media than what was traditionally around during those periods where you saw rally around the flag effect. You know, we're well beyond the days of 3 network dominance and, you know, 2 major newspaper dominance of everything. I don't think that we're going to see effects that big again. Possibly if the US was directly involved in this conflict, then we would be seeing a bigger effect. But I think that at the moment, we're not going to see this budging Biden's approval ratings very much.
Yeah, so the way, look, I agree with all of that, but the idea that 40s are the new normal with approval ratings as a metric, as a barometer of the president's stock of political capital, we need a new calibration of it. I think it's a real insight, David. If you were to plot the difference between the in-party rating of the president and the out-party rating of a president, that gap, indeed, in the very first poll, right, the first poll, a day after, a week after inauguration, what the president's partisans say about that president and what the out-party, that gap has been getting bigger since Bill Clinton. So now an approval rating is averaging one mob who are generally very enthusiastic about their guy or gal, but guys thus far. Another mob who, because of, I think, the media environment as well, are getting an information stream and have a set of predispositions and information that lead them to say the opposite, and a small set in the middle that are really driving the ups and downs and the bumps and wiggles. But when you average those out, 40s, tracking around the 40s is probably the new normal. I think that's probably right, but nonetheless, it's sort of still historically weird to see, and weird to see. The other thing about rally around the flag is, you know, the way it was taught to me, and the way I've studied it is it's a partisan framing as well. Why does a president approval ratings spike in a positive direction because partisan discourse is temporarily suspended, and partisan elites from both sides are sending messages that the president has our support and it's a time for all those sorts of national unity messages. They're not, I'd say, a big part of the discourse right now. Why? Because, as you pointed out, David, American blood and treasure, perhaps it's just the treasure at this point, but not the blood, thank heavens. Number one, but number two, there isn't that partisan unity that there are. I know you're citing those polls that say 80% plus approve of what the US is doing. You replace that with what the Biden administration or Biden's handling, that'll fall immediately with the partisan cue there. But you've got, and I think this is something I can't let our webinar go without drawing attention to. It's an odd moment where you've got more than one or two voices in the Republican Party, and certainly some leading media figures in that ecosystem. Frankly, Putin's way smarter than all of us. Grudging, if not more than grudging, admiration for Putin. And indeed, that one poll, and I don't know how much to make of this, that among Republicans, Putin has higher approval ratings than Joe Biden. And of course, the last few establishment Republicans, Mitt Romney and Liz Cheney, just going ballistic berserk about that on weekend television.
Yeah,
Victoria,
to be fair, David. Sorry, can I just add, to be fair, for Democrats, the approval rating for Putin is higher than it is for Trump. I think there is a sense among both Republicans and Democrats that the real enemy is at home. What do I care what Putin is doing in another country? It's my own president who's destroying my democracy. So I think that, that kind of environment is, that's why we're seeing those kinds of results.
That's the typically deep and penetrating insight and pithy, great form of words, the real enemy is at home, that leads me to pivot to, that we associate with you, David, thanks, which is a great tee off to Victoria. Studying extremist views is part of your portfolio, Victoria. I'm just wondering, any reactions to that that grad seminar David and I just had about rally round the flag and the current state of polarization in the United States, given what's happening with Ukraine, and again, given the context of this speech coming up tomorrow?
Yeah, I suppose so. I mean, an interesting statistic I've been finding at the moment is amongst polarization, another area where America is quite divided is along age. I think a statistic I found particularly interesting was that in the January 6th insurrection, the average age was 41, whereas in most of these kind of populist or authoritarian uprisings against an executive power, the average age is typically a lot younger. So it's in the 20s and 30s. So you have older people that are more politically engaged. And I think that's coming across in a lot of commentary, is that younger people are disengaged. And that's a statistic that David was referring to before about Ukraine and the approval of sanctions. There's less young people are supportive of those sanctions. I wonder if I have the statistic on that, but it was that 70% of people who are in that baby boomer generation were supportive of those sanctions, but significantly less of young people, especially if it did lead to increased costs for inflation. You can look at more statistics along those lines. There's more younger people still living with their parents. I think the United States Study Center has done polling on this, and it's not by age, but 60% of Americans in December 2021 thought the best days of America were behind them. And that's, 15% more than who were reporting that sentiment in July 2019. And so I think there's a sense of disenfranchisement and disappointment. And I wonder if even dejection among young people, and they're the ones looking to their future and seeing things like distractions in Ukraine. And I suppose this has happened before. There's echoes of this in Afghanistan. But if you look at one of the justifying things that convinced Biden to withdraw from Afghanistan, he said the reasons for being there were increasingly unclear. And for young people who grew up not knowing what America looked like before Afghanistan and not knowing what America looked like before that unipolar moment, that kind of, people aged between their 20s and 30s, foreign policy interventions overseas, whether that be for Ukraine or for Afghanistan, they don't resonate as strongly. And what does is things like inflation, like polarization, like climate change that haven't been receiving that kind of attention, and social spending bills that haven't yet gone through, the things that haven't yet received the attention and the success that young people voted Biden in for. And they did vote him in. I have a statistic here that among people aged under 30 in 2020, Biden beat Trump out in their votes by 20 percentage points. So, 59% of them voted for Biden, whereas 33% for Trump. So it's young people there for Biden, for him to be a transformational leader and to look to the future. And that's not all happening. And so distractions overseas like this, I think, are particularly demoralizing for that younger group.
So Bruce, that's going to bring me back to you, because Ukraine gives Biden an opportunity to, and one that he needs, as you said earlier. But how do you talk about, extract political capital from the Ukraine crisis, and frankly, the US playing, at least for now, a pretty strong set of cards, playing the game pretty well there, I would assess, and as do many others, according to opinion polls, against this huge domestic overhang. You mentioned the inflation crisis earlier, this sense that things aren't in control, or a real emotional trigger for voters. I want to come back to you to sort of wrap up our review of how this speech sits in the context before we get to some audience questions.
The speech is going to be given where you have different levels of enthusiasm in each party for their leaders. The latest polling shows among Democrats, about 2/3 of them are very supportive of Biden, but among Republicans, 90% of Republicans are behind their party's leadership. They smell blood. They feel that they're right. The Democrats are weak, divisive, socialist, so forth, and they're going after that. A reason for the lack of enthusiasm on the Democratic side is that, aside from all the social spending things that we outlined, there are other things that have not been delivered. Voting rights is dying in the Senate. Gun control is dying in the Senate. The Supreme Court has gone to the conservatives. And even with the appointment of Judge Jackson, it's not going to rectify that imbalance. So what the message that Biden has to leave the country with is, if you're unhappy, unsatisfied with what Washington is doing, the reason's not me. I'm standing for all the things that you want. Elect more Democrats if you want this done. If I had 51 Democrats in the Senate, I could get this done. If I had a stronger majority, I can get this done. And it actually, to his credit, Victoria's point of doing more with less, the 98% of Democrats were united on his agenda, and it passed the House and is in the Senate. Obama couldn't do that. Clinton certainly couldn't do that. So it is a tribute, but it's underappreciated at a time of real angst about the lack of normalcy in the country. And the thing here in Colorado, I'm in a place where there's a boom in hotels, a boom in housing construction, a boom in new restaurants and so forth. And I go into supermarkets and the shelves are not half empty, but there's stuff that's not there. A bag of cookies cost $11.99 a pound last week, $12.99 a pound this week. Now, I can buy the cookies, but people are not happy with what they're getting. And that really is a core that Biden has to tackle and turn around. And this speech is an opportunity. I think it would do okay, but it's not going to, there's no dramatic transformation in his presidency that's coming tomorrow night.
With that, I do want to make sure that the balance of our time, as promised, we work in some reactions to some of these excellent questions that came in both ahead of the webinar and live. Look, one thing I want to get to is USSC polling that we're about to release next month shows a real marked contrast certainly in everything between Democrats and Republicans, but especially on not just domestic policy priorities, but on foreign policy priorities. You ask Republicans what things in the world the United States should be focused on. It's standing up to China, tops the list. You ask Democrats, at least back in December when we did this polling, it's climate change. And there's a huge gulf there. And we'll have more to say about that in the middle of March as we release our annual State of the United States report on March 16. But I'm wondering, Bruce, I'll start with you on this one. Is there going to be more support for bigger defense budgets, for perhaps less emphasis on climate change as an initial priority, but shoring up alliances, I think where the Biden national security team has been and came to office talking a very strong game about that, but the base of the party and indeed key roll call votes in both Senate and House reveal that perhaps the party is not where the executive branch has been on this thing. Do you see what's going on right now in Ukraine prompting a recalibration perhaps of those priorities among Democrats, and in terms of the messages that get sent from Democratic elites back into the party's rank and file?
Yes, I think so. And Biden will frame it as, again, the classic proposition that he's put forward, that it's between autocracy and democracy. And this is a time when we have to step up. And I said we would be back with NATO, and we are back, and so forth. But this does stretch Democratic constituencies. If you have more gasoline to ease price pressures, that means less climate change. If you're spending more in defense, that means less for social spending. So the left flank of the Democratic Party is going to not be happy. But these measures on security and defense will pass, because that is where mainstream Republicans and where mainstream Republicans really are on these issues has been revealed by what's happening in Ukraine. So the votes are there to do this, but the political consequences are perilous for Democrats under these circumstances.
David or Victoria, any reactions to that? Because where I want to go to next is also a rethink perhaps in the United States, something that, a lot of anxiety about the attention in Australia, about the attention the US political system, but perhaps is giving to theaters other than the Indo-Pacific. And here we are again, literally a week or two after the release of a long-awaited Indo-Pacific strategy document from the administration, and no one's talking about the Indo-Pacific this week, or likely for the next couple of weeks. And any thoughts about that? The way that Biden might choose, as Bruce alluded to use his speech as a rallying cry for a theme from his earlier speech to Congress about this battle for democracy, a battle for the 21st century. How many times will we hear the word China or Indo-Pacific in the speech? David, perhaps.
Yeah, and before getting to that, I just want to note that huge defense budgets are a very consistently bipartisan area of US policy. Biden hasn't cut the defense budget at all. It's still above $700 billion. He's being criticized because inflation means that $700 billion doesn't buy what it used to. But I'm sure that defense budgets are going to increase. It's really a political no-brainer because it's related to national security, and also it's an engine of the US economy. I think that Biden is going to talk a lot about democracy in abstract terms. I don't know. I'm not going to predict how much he's going to talk about China specifically, I think that given what we're seeing at the moment is that China is actually cutting Russia loose to some extent. So China abstained in the UN Security Council vote rather than voting with Russia. And two of China's big four banks have now imposed sanctions on Russia. They're not doing business with Russia. The fact that China is actually, despite the fact that there was these weeks of it apparently increased closeness that it had with Russia in the lead up to this, the fact that China is now distancing itself from Russia, maybe that would cause Biden perhaps not to go a completely antagonistic route towards China in this speech, because Chinese media will be watching it as well. But I really don't know. The Biden administration just seems so determined to confront China. As one commentator said, Biden's policy towards China is basically Trump's, but with allies. It's maintaining that level of confrontation. It's maintaining most of the trade barriers that were put up in the trade war, but emphasizing the fact that it's doing it in concert with allies. But, presidents often don't get to choose which part of the world is the major focus at any given time. And given the immediacy of the Ukraine crisis, I do wonder whether this speech might be a little bit less confrontational towards China than it would have been otherwise. I could be completely wrong about that. Biden might instead decide this is the time to go full on, defense of democracy everywhere, no matter who's threatening it, whether it's Putin, Xi, or Trump. But the delicacy of the circumstances. We're still in the first week of this war. Potentially, what China does could really affect the outcome of the war in terms of giving or not giving Russia economic lifelines when the rest of those lifelines are being cut off. It'll be interesting to see what he does.
A lot of wisdom there, David, as usual. That's a lot of food for thought there, but time is tight, so I'm going to, rather than respond, Victoria, why don't you have a swing at that one?
Yeah, I think a lot of what's being covered I would agree with. The only thing I would add is that the classic conundrum for the Biden administration is that all the right sentiment and all the intention is there, but the delivery just consistently seems to be falling short. I think if you look in June last year, the Senate passed the United States Innovation and Competition Act with 2 Senate majority support, which is massive. When you look at how divided and how much media attention that divided Senate gets, to have 6 votes in favor of a US Innovation and Competition Act is massive. And that was an expensive bill. And it was also known as the anti-China bill. And that was because all of the ways that America was going to improve its industrial capacity, the ways that it was going to invest in its domestic manufacturing of chips, for example, all of those things were set to improve American jobs, American livelihoods, and contribute to a better domestic scene for manufacturing in America and for essentially the American economy. So again, the intention is there. It's yet to pass the House, and that keeps happening. Right. Is that it's the intentions are there, and then nothing seems to materialize from that. And so I wonder if this current thing in Ukraine is going to be a similar case where the Biden administration has all the right intentions and the right intention to keep that domestic focus at home, to build up its domestic capacity, and that's going to be thwarted by distractions overseas or by perhaps infighting in the House or other distractions that might derail that focus.
I'm so pleased you brought up that particular bill, Victoria, because I think we tell ourselves in Australia, there's a bipartisan consensus on China in the United States. And that's true, but only up to a point. Relative to the profound level of partisan polarization that exists in the United States, is China a strategic competitor with the US? Yes, you'll get broad agreement on that. What to do about it, or how urgently to do things about that. Very quickly, you start to see disagreements. The fact that the so-called anti-China legislation hasn't come through the House. I want to hear if Bruce has got a take on that. He understands the Democratic House caucus better than certainly anyone in Australia, seriously, and many in the US. But also, David, so Congress, at the end of the day, they've passed a bigger defense budget or authorization than the administration asked. It got amended up, but it split the Democrats in the Senate on final passage. It passes with all Republicans for it, and a really quite big split. There's been a few other votes like that in the U.S. Senate. Military shipments to Saudi Arabia split the Democrats, for instance. And so while I think at a high level abstraction, yes, there is a bipartisan consensus about China, the translation of that into policy, and in particular through the Democratic caucus, perhaps more so in the House and the Senate, but the Senate's got some interesting votes to point to. Interesting, and I can't let this go. This will be a big focus of our State of the United States report. This last 5 or 10 minutes of conversation is a theme that we visit in much detail in our State of the United States report. But Bruce, any reactions to those observations about where Dems are on some of these national security strategic matters?
I think Biden is going to call out for Congress to finally approve that bill, and it'll put the House Democrats who have some reservations into an impossible position, and the bill should pass. And I think he'll use the moment of crisis in Europe to say we have to be as best prepared as we possibly can be. So I actually think it's going to get a specific mention, and there'll be big applause for it on the floor. And
Okay.
it will pass by July 4th.
By July 4th.
Yeah.
That date. Okay. By the summer.
Independence Day. Celebrate it.
Okay. A question here from Fred Chilton, a regular on our webinars. Is Trump and indeed some other Republicans, the comments about Putin's strategic savvy and genius and whatnot, is that a net positive or a net negative for Trump seeking to run and potentially running in 2024? David, anybody want to weigh in on that?
I would suggest it's probably a net nothing, as is so often the case with these things. I don't think it particularly helps him, because there are actually a lot of Republicans who don't share that view of Putin. So as much as the hardcore Trump base will love those comments, the people who are watching Tucker Carlson saying very similar things, it's not going to broaden his support in any way, even among Republicans, let alone among Democrats. But Trump says so many things all the time. Really, this was something that got attention put back on him briefly. So as far as he's concerned, that's probably a net gain. One of the things that we should have learned from his presidency is that there's no comment, no position, hardly even any action that Trump takes that makes a difference in the end, because there just are so many of them. And the way that people feel about Trump, it's not related to these kinds of things. It's related to deeper issues around identity and worldview.
Anything to add, Victoria, beyond nodding your assent?
No, I mean, next question, we've probably got time for one more, I think.
Okay. Hey, a great question. One that we're perhaps we don't pay enough attention to. I don't know. It comes and goes. But Carolyn Kennedy, Bruce, an ambassador for Australia. Any news? I imagine a Ukraine crisis, a crisis in Eastern Europe, occupying just so much bandwidth from the administration and indeed Congress as well, isn't exactly going to speed up the nomination, or might it actually be helpful. And any thoughts from you, Bruce, on that one, knowing Congress as you do about the machinations there? Has a nomination actually gone up to the Senate yet, or where are we?
I believe it has. The key thing to watch is the hearing, and when that occurs, then there should be a vote shortly thereafter. I think there's every reason for her to be in Australia as soon as possible, because in August there have been tensions with India, for example, on the Ukraine situation, and then the China-Russia entente. It's all very, very important. So I think she's eager. I think Biden is eager to have her here, but the key thing to watch is when her hearing is scheduled, and then the process will move very quickly.
Do you have a theory of the case as to for an important ally? And I'm not going to say United Kingdom and Japan. I think we have to be realistic about where Australia sits in the pecking order. In fact, perhaps if anything, the stability of the relationship, just the huge, institutional sort of guardrails, if you will, sort of mean things go quite well with State Department, career people running the relationship, and defense to defense, intelligence agencies, all those relationships trucking along. But do you have a theory as to why the Senate hasn't taken this up yet?
No, I think they've just been on a whole raft of appointments. They've just been slow in putting them forward. And there's no issue on paperwork or anything like that, because she was an ambassador. It really goes to the larger political question that we're talking about. Is Washington working anymore? I mean, are people getting things done? And I think there is frustration that our system is paralyzed. It's hyper partisan. It's not doing anything constructive for it. And everyone is getting blamed. Everyone in power, and the Democrats are in power, they control the government, is getting blamed. And I think she's part of this larger problem.
Fair enough. Look, that's bringing us up to the top of the hour. So I'm going to go ahead and wrap up proceedings. I want to thank you all. That was a really great conversation. We managed to cover an awful lot of ground in 55 minutes or so after top and tail. So my thanks to you all. Let me just one more time tease the fact that a lot of these themes, and indeed a lot of original research by the United States Study Center that speaks to these questions, will feature in our State of the United States report, sort of this annual landmark publication, well over 100 pages in length. We are launching that in Canberra at a half-day event at Hotel Realm in Canberra, but we will be live streaming it for those of you not in Canberra and not at the event. But we've got fabulous buy-in we've got Congressman Joe Courtney, who is the co-chair of the Friends of Australia Caucus, Democratic co-chair of the Friends of Australia Caucus. We've got the Defence Minister, Peter Dutton, will be making some remarks. And we've also got the Shadow Defence Minister, Brendan O'Connor, and the Shadow Foreign Affairs Minister, Penny Wong, and many others that were still sort of bedding down, from senior thought leaders across the Australian strategic affairs community and people from the bureaucracy. And again, the agenda spans this look at US domestic politics, the implications for America's foreign policy agenda and for Australian national interests. That is our brief with the State of the United States on Wednesday, March 16. And again, a half-day event. And please do keep an eye out for that one. Thanks, Bruce. Thanks, David. Thanks,
Thank
Victoria.
you.
Always a pleasure.
Yeah.
Thanks to
Great
everybody who joined us online. And thanks to Janine back at Mission Control, keeping us all up and online, and the feed out to YouTube Live. And thanks everybody around Australia and indeed around the world who joined us today. Thanks so much. See you next time.